Hello everyone, and welcome to my recording on Chapter 7, and I'm just going to move the screen and start our PowerPoint presentation. So this chapter continues our discussion from Chapter 6 on freedom and ideologies, and if you'll remember correctly, in Chapter 6 we were talking about the ideologies of liberal democracy, social democracy, and Marxism, and different perceptions of freedom, whether freedom and the acknowledgement of rights and liberties are based on what we call natural law or from God, um, or are they based on utilitarianism, which we talked about with Jeremy Bentham from England, and the concept that looking at society through a scientific lens and its changes should then allow us to change laws, right? Utilitarian laws, laws that reflect new norms, changing norms in society. So now that we've looked at sort of the ideologies of free society, whether you can be free through a market-based system or one that's sort of a system in which the government helps to manage the market and provides more services than in a more capital liberal democracy system, so social democracy, or one in which the government is a more egalitarian structure like that in Marxism. And so what really is the perception of freedom? Now we travel to Chapter 7, where we talk about different types of systems of free societies. And so here are some questions that I'd like you to ponder as you're looking at this system, right? These are really the crux of what this chapter is about. And we look at some free societies. Of course, one of the most prolific and exciting times for freedom was the end of the apartheid system, the election of Nelson Mandela in 1993 in South Africa. And so what exactly is democracy but a system in which citizens, the demos, control the system? But it can mean different things, right? Clearly, Saudi Arabia and King Abdullah, that is what we would call a dictatorship, an authoritarian system. And so there we have the definition of a dictatorship, right? One in which citizens do not control the operations of their government. And here we have the definition of a constitution, and a constitution really sets out the structure of institutions and the rights and liberties of people. Here we have the U.S. democracy, which is very vertical, right? Top down. We have a federal level, a state, and a local level. There are differences, though, between a unitary government, like in France, which everything derives from, say, the middle of France or the capital, let's say, Paris, and goes out, right? Or the federal government, like the United States has, where there's sort of state structure, okay, and a more vertical federal structure rather that informs states. So the Constitution is the federal structure that informs the behavior of the states, okay? And then there's a confederal structure like the cantons in Switzerland, in which the cantons, which we think of maybe as states, they really control very autonomously the running of the government of Switzerland. So for example, different types of schedules and school structures and health care, even taxation is run differently in different cantons. And there you have the unitary difference from the federal difference. And you see from a unitary structure, the national government decides regional and local issues. Whereas in the federal structure, the national government does decide some of those things because our structure is based on an overarching constitution. But our states and even local governments are in many ways very autonomous. And here we have a system that is extremely federal, the German system. And there's Chancellor or Prime Minister Angela Merkel. And I want to move on to the difference in presidential and prime ministerial systems, right, or parliamentary systems. So in the U.S., you know we have a presidential system. And then in the UK, we know we have a parliamentary system, one in which the prime minister is actually the head of the party that won the majority, okay, or 51% of the legislative branch or parliament. Now, of course, the monarch in the UK, the Queen, for example, is the ceremonial chief of state, meaning not elected, okay, a constitutional monarch, or there's a ceremonial president in some cases, as in the case of Germany. But the prime minister and the cabinet are usually elected by the legislature because their party has won the majority of seats in parliament. So the interesting difference is the president in the United States, for example, is elected separately, okay? And people don't generally elect a president necessarily on party. They elect the president sometimes on individual characteristics, sometimes on party. However, the prime minister is elected via party, and the prime minister is the head of the party that wins the majority in the election. So there's in a parliamentary system, there's a lot of party identification, okay, between, say, examples, conservatives, Tories, and Labour Party in the UK. And there you can see, so the majority party, okay, then controls the prime ministerial or executive position and the cabinet and the parliament in the UK. So there you can see where a lot of passage of legislation would occur. Whereas in the United States, we can have a divided House and Senate, but we can also have a divided Congress from the executive branch, like we have right now in the United States in 2015, President Obama of the Democratic Party, and then a Senate and House that has the Republican Party as majority. And there we have, for example, different systems like the UK or Israel that have prime ministers. Right now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just addressed Congress yesterday, okay? And in Israel, they have a president as well. Now, that president is a ceremonial chief, meaning attends, represents the country in certain ceremonies, invited dignitaries with invited dignitaries, etc. Same for the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth. And there you can see what ceremonial duties there are. Now, in the case of a hung parliament, what that means is, in a parliamentary system, if you have 40% Labor, 20 Liberal Democrat, and 40 Conservative, in that case, the Liberal Democrats will have to align with either the Conservatives or Labor in order to change the structure of Parliament and therefore the Prime Minister. And of course, a constitutional monarchy is one in which the real political power comes from a political system in which democracy occurs, and a royal executive is inherently undemocratic because they're not elected, okay, like King Abdullah of Jordan is not elected. Now, a combination system is one, a combination system is one in which the executive would have differentiating duties. So the president handles foreign affairs and the prime minister handles domestic issues. And France has this type of system. They have a 5-year system in which the president is directly elected and then the prime minister is appointed, and the way the prime minister is appointed by the president is the prime minister wins the majority of seats in the National Assembly and the Senate. And so the prime minister handles the duties that are domestic, and the president handles, like President Hollande of France now, handles the foreign policy duties. And there you have the Prime Minister and President of France. President Hollande is on the left and the Prime Minister Valls is on the right. And so President Hollande of France has been very engaged, very active in conversations on ISIS and Syria, as well as on Iranian nuclear weapons talks in Switzerland right now with Secretary of State John Kerry. And here we have President Putin of Russia, and this chapter, he's been president twice, as we all know, and we also know that there has been tension between Russia over Crimea and parts of the Ukraine and the Western response to it. And here we have examples of other systems. Legislative systems can also be quite interesting, right? Because it's the legislature where laws are made and passed. And so I'd like to point out that in we have a bicameral system in the United States, okay? And here you can see a picture of the British Parliament, okay? Also House of Lords, House of Commons. But we have different types of systems. And one is the single member constituency system, or first past the post, meaning whoever wins the majority wins. Then we have a proportional representation system. And what that means is the percentage of votes the party get are the percentage of seats that it gets in the legislature. So, for example, if your party wins 20% of the votes, and there's 100 seats in the legislature, then it gets 20 seats. Whereas in a single member constituency system, your voters are divided by districts, and whoever wins the majority in that district wins that seat. And then a mixed member proportional system, MMP, is one that Germany has, which the Land have, or the Land is state, the word for state in Germany. They have representatives from each state, or Land. And then they also do a proportional representation. And in Germany, that's been very effective in getting the Green or Environmental Party voted into the Bundestag and the Bundesrat, which are the names of their bicameral legislative houses. And there you can see definitions of each of the systems, right? So you can see that the blue circles are the districts in a single member constituency, right? And so if Party B gets 51% of the vote, then it wins that district and gets the seat in the legislature. And that's how that plays out mathematically. And here's just an example of in 2000, when the majority of the votes, the plurality of the population voted for Al Gore, but because Ralph Nader was also in that election, he impacted greatly that election. So in fact, district-wise, George Bush won the election in 2000. You all remember the controversy surrounding that election and the ballot. And here you have just an explanation of that numerically. And there's some videos of a recent Brazilian election. And one thing that some presidential democracies do is, if no one gets over 50% of the vote in the first election, they have a second or runoff election where parties have to align and support the two top candidates. And that's what happened to Dilma Rousseff, and you can watch this in Brazil's recent election in 2014. And here's an explanation of proportional representation, okay, like in Israel. And here's an example of a combination of that system, like in Germany, and an explanation of that. And Japan and Italy and Brazil and New Zealand have this mixed member proportional representation as well. And so that concludes my explanation of Chapter 7, really sort of a survey of the different types of governmental systems and representative systems that we have in free societies or democracies. The rest of the chapter goes over and explains what a constitutional monarch is, one that is part of a democracy, and what a royal monarch is, for example, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, and those are non-elected positions in undemocratic societies. So this is a survey in Chapter 7 of democracies and the different types of democracies. And what I hope you realize after reading this chapter is that even though the structure of Israel or New Zealand or Brazil or Italy or Germany or France is different, or the UK for that matter, parliamentary executive or presidential executive, they're all democracies, and it's different ways of organizing ourselves. And certainly is interesting to consider whether the way the U.S. organizes its democracy is still effective in the year 2015. Thanks so much for listening.